the coming of the Second World War came more changes for Sentinel Publishing. Several of their top creators either volunteered or were drafted in the weeks and months after Pearl Harbor. Most notably, their lead artist and writer, Harvey Brooks himself.
I was drafted in March of '42 and wound up in field artillery training at Fort Sill. One of my sergeants at Basic learned I was an artist and told me the Army needed people who could make maps. Sounded good to me. Artillery guys riding trucks, so not so much marching. My job ended up being going in early to wherever the artillery pieces were headed and taking pictures of the area and then drawing maps from the pictures.
Brooks, serving in the 3rd Artillery, participated in the invasion of Italy from North Africa. He fought in the famous Monte Cassino campaign, where his unit served next to a division from the New Zealand Army made up almost entirely of Maori natives. He made friends with several of them over the months that he was there.
The Maori soldiers I met were really fascinating. Their culture, their stories. So when I returned to America and went back to writing comics, one of the first things I wanted to write was a Maori character. That's where Haka came from.
Sentinel sales remained strong during the war, and with many of their regular writers and artists unavailable, they struggled to meet demand both at home and at PX stores on military bases. Julia Tucci ghost wrote a large number of the scripts during this period, whether it was superheroes, science fiction, westerns, or funny animals. But she rarely got any of the published credits.
So after the soldiers came back from the war, sales of superhero titles started to fall off. Young soldiers were getting jobs and starting families. So there's this new generation of kids coming along, and the titles from other publishers that were selling big to them weren't superheroes. They were true crime and horror comics. And the more lurid, the more awful, the more shocking those comics were to their parents, the better they sold.
Sentinel followed this trend like they had with superheroes, introducing new titles like Criminal Element, Tome of the Bizarre, which starred occult detective Thomas Diamond, and most notoriously, Shudder, which kids knew had the scariest and goriest stories in art. It was comics like these that drew the attention of F. Morton Selinker. Selinker was a Kansas City-based politician who had been the losing Republican candidate for one of Missouri's Senate seats in 1946. He continued to campaign across the state on a platform of fighting communism and cleaning up objectionable movies, television shows, music, and, of course, comic books.
I know it sounds crazy, but you can't argue with facts. Studies have shown that 95% of children in reform schools have one thing in common. They read comic books. Huh?
So Tucci wrote an essay defending comics from Selinker's charges that they caused juvenile delinquency. The essay appeared in several Sentinel comics in 1949, and Selinker took his criticism very personally. They kept writing pieces back and forth in the press, Reader's Digest, and even the editorial pages of the National Review, basically having this argument in public.
Selinker won the Senate race in his second try in 1950, and he quickly joined a coalition with fellow senators such as Joseph McCarthy. At Selinker's lead, the Senate formed the Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency, and Bob Tucci was called upon to testify. The scene quickly turned confrontational as Tucci was forced to respond to several senators criticizing the content of his horror and crime comics. However, Selinker had saved his final attack on his old rival for the last.
Mr. Tucci, now, isn't it a fact that your father-in-law is none other than Dominic Cataneo, head of the largest St. Louis organized crime family?
Where's it going?
And isn't it also true that Sentinel Comics is nothing more than a front for the mob?
Don't answer that, boss. You don't have to answer.
Answer the question!
You don't have to say anything, boss.
Though it had never been a particularly well-kept secret, the public outcry meant the end for Sentinel Comics. at least as far as the Tucci's were concerned.